The air hung thick and still over the Arizona territory, the kind of stillness that spoke of recent violence and uncertain peace. The treaty had been signed a scant month ago, a fragile promise etched onto parchment that felt as flimsy as the desert scrub against the relentless wind. Soldiers still patrolled the fringes, their gazes wary, while the scattered remnants of Apache bands slowly began the tentative journey back to what was left of their lives. For many, home was a concept now as ephemeral as a mirage on the shimmering horizon. The land itself, once a vibrant tapestry of their ancestors' heritage, had become a contested battleground, its dust stained with the tears of a displaced people. The weight of generations of knowledge and tradition hung heavy in the desolate air, a silent testament to a world irrevocably altered. Jedediah "Jed" Stone watched them from the porch of his isolated ranch house, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. His ranch, a modest spread carved out of the rugged terrain, had weathered its share of hardship, drought, rustlers, the gnawing loneliness that came with being the only soul for miles. He'd built it with his own hands, each timber a testament to his resilience, each fence post driven deep into the stubborn earth a mark of his claim. He'd seen the fear in the eyes of the Apache, the weariness etched deep into their faces, a profound sorrow that transcended language. He'd also seen the stubborn pride that even defeat couldn't extinguish, a spark of defiance that flickered in their dark eyes. He knew what it was to lose everything, to stand alone against a world that seemed determined to break you. His own past was a tapestry of loss, threadbare in places, but woven with the sturdy fibers of survival. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth to a cracked, ochre expanse, mirroring the parched landscape of his own heart. The wagon train had come through 3 days past, carrying the last of the surrendered. Jed had ridden into the makeshift settlement near the creek, a knot of curiosity and a flicker of something akin to hope tightening in his chest. He'd hoped to trade for some much-needed supplies, perhaps even hear word from a distant relative he hadn't seen in years, a faint echo from a lifelong past. But the camp was a somber affair, the air heavy with the unspoken grief of loss and displacement. The meager possessions of a people uprooted lay scattered amidst the dust, a stark tableau of shattered lives. The quiet hum of voices carried on the wind spoke of resignation, not celebration. Children, their faces smudged with dirt, clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed too old for their young faces. The stench of wood smoke and unwashed bodies hung in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of despair. It was there, amidst the milling crowd of weary faces, that he saw her. She stood apart, a small figure wrapped in a tattered shawl, her dark eyes wide and luminous, reflecting the harsh sunlight like polished obsidian. She looked no older than 7 or 8, her face smudged with dust, her thin frame hinting at a recent lack of food. Her clothes, once vibrant, were now faded and torn, a testament to a harsh journey. Unlike the other Apache children who clung to their mother's skirts, seeking comfort and safety in shared misery, she stood alone, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon, as if searching for a forgotten path or a vanished dream. There was a profound stillness about her, a quiet dignity that belied her tender age and desperate circumstances, a silence that seemed to hum with untold stories. Jed felt a tug in his gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was a familiar ache, one that resonated with his own deep-seated loneliness. He'd lost his own family to a fever years ago, a loss that had left a hollow ache in his heart, a chasm that no amount of hard work or solitude could ever truly fill. His wife, Sarah, and their young son, Thomas, had been taken by the swift and merciless hand of disease, leaving Jed to face the vast emptiness of his ranch alone. He'd learned to live with the solitude, to find solace in the rhythm of ranch life, in the predictable chores that filled his days. But seeing this lost child stirred something within him that he thought had long been dormant, a forgotten warmth, a flicker of paternal instinct. He lingered near the edge of the crowd, a silent observer. Watching her, he saw the soldiers glance her way, their expressions indifferent, their faces hardened by years of conflict and the weary detachment that comes with enforcing an uneasy peace. He saw the other Apache families, their hands already full with their own burdens, their own griefs, offer her no acknowledgement, no comforting touch. It was as if she were a ghost, a shadow lingering on the edges of their shared tragedy. Unseen and unheard, no one called out to her, no one reached for her hand. She was an island of forgotten hope in a sea of shared despair. The sun climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the camp, but she remained motionless, a small, still point in a world of turmoil. As the day wore on and the wagons began to depart, creaking and groaning under their meager loads, Jed noticed she remained. The last of the Apache families climbed aboard their wagons, their faces turned towards an uncertain future, their backs to the past. He saw one of the army officers speak briefly with her, a perfunctory exchange, then shrug and turn away, his duty done, his conscience clear. The officer, a gruff man with a handlebar mustache, gestured dismissively toward the open road, as if to say, "Go on, child. There's nothing for you here." But the girl remained, rooted to the spot, her eyes still, searching the empty horizon. The other Apache families had moved on, their figures receding into the dusty landscape, becoming mere specks against the vastness. She was utterly alone, a fragile bloom in a desolate land, abandoned by all. Dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple as Jed finally approached her. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and distant wood smoke. She didn't flinch as he drew near, her dark eyes simply meeting his with a quiet resignation that belied her young age. There was no fear in her gaze, only a profound weariness. He knelt down, his weathered face level with hers, the lines around his eyes crinkling in concern. "Hello, little one," he said, his voice rough from disuse but undeniably gentle, a stark contrast to the harsh whispers of the wind. She didn't answer, didn't even blink, her expression unchanging. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a piece of jerky he'd saved for his supper, offering it to her. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking from his hand to his face, then reached out a small, dirt-stained hand and took it with a surprising swiftness. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite, her eyes still fixed on him, with an unsettling intensity. When she was finished, he pointed towards his ranch in the distance, a faint smudge against the darkening sky, silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight. "That's my home," he said, his voice a quiet invitation. "Would you like to come again?" She didn't answer, no words escaping her lips, but this time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of curiosity, perhaps, even a sliver of hope, a fragile bloom in the wasteland of her young life. Jed stood up and held out his hand, his palm open and inviting. After a long moment, a hesitation that stretched into an eternity, she placed her small hand in his, her fingers surprisingly cold against his calloused skin. It was a gesture of trust, simple yet profound. The walk back to the ranch was silent. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the dry earth, a rhythmic counterpoint to the thrumming silence of the desert, and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote, a lonely voice in the vast expanse. As they reached the porch, bathed in the growing darkness, Jed gestured for her to sit on the wooden step. He went inside, the lamp casting flickering shadows as he moved, and returned with a blanket, thick and warm, and a tin cup of water, cool and refreshing. She accepted them both with the same quiet dignity, her eyes never leaving his. He sat beside her, the vast expanse of the desert stretching out before them under the watchful gaze of a million stars that glittered like scattered diamonds on a velvet cloth. The Milky Way arched overhead, a shimmering ribbon of light across the inky blackness. He didn't know her name, no one had offered it, and she hadn't spoken a single word since he'd found her. He looked down at the dusty ground beside him, the fine, reddish soil yielding easily to his touch. Using his index finger, he slowly traced his own name, the letters forming imperfectly in the dim light. J-E-D. Then, beside it, he hesitated, a blank space in the dust, a silent question, waiting for an answer. He looked at the girl, her small form wrapped in the blanket, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight, mirroring the endless depths of the night sky. He didn't know her past, her tribe, or even the name her parents had given her. But in that moment, under the silent, indifferent stars, a profound realization settled over him. He couldn't leave her unclaimed. He couldn't let her vanish into the shadows, a forgotten casualty of a brutal war. He felt an undeniable pull, a deep-seated need to offer her not just shelter, but a sense of belonging. He dipped his finger again in the dust and slowly, carefully, with a tenderness he hadn't known he still possessed, wrote a name that felt right. A name that held a whisper of the wild beauty of the land and a hint of the quiet strength he saw in her eyes. A name that seemed to spring from the very essence of the desert itself, Winona. The letters formed deliberately, each stroke a silent promise. Jedediah Stone, Winona. Two names etched in the dust, a silent promise in the vast emptiness of the West, a testament to a fragile, burgeoning hope. The wind would eventually erase the names, but the silent pact forged between a lonely rancher and a lost Apache girl under the starlit sky would endure. The air in Jedediah's cabin, once a bastion of solitude, now hummed with a different kind of quiet. The quiet of Winona's presence. It wasn't the heavy silence of absence, but a silence pregnant with untold stories, a profound understanding blossoming without the need for words. Winona moved through the small house with an almost ghost-like stillness, her small frame graceful, her dark eyes wide and luminous, observing Jed, absorbing the subtle rhythms of his daily routine, every creak of the floorboards, every clatter of a pot, every sigh he let escape. She seemed to register, filing away these domestic sounds into the growing library of her new life. She was like a silent shadow, always there but never intrusive, a watchful spirit inhabiting his once empty world. Jed, in turn, learned to read the subtle nuances of the girl, the slight furrow of her brow when she was curious, the fleeting, almost imperceptible smile that touched her lips when she watched the wild rabbits darting through the fields outside, or the way her gaze would linger on a distant cloud formation, lost in thoughts he couldn't access. He offered her clean clothes, mended with care by his calloused, rough hands, their stitches a testament to his newfound attentiveness. He prepared simple, nourishing meals, stew, beans, fresh bread, which she ate with a quiet dignity and a profound, unspoken gratitude. There was a solemnity to her eating, as if each bite was a precious gift, a stark contrast to the casual way he took his own sustenance for granted. The first few days were marked by a pervasive caution. Winona remained mostly silent, a small, watchful sentinel, observing Jed from a safe, almost detached vantage point. She rarely ventured beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin's warmth, sticking close to the walls, as if always ready to disappear into the shadows. He didn't press her to speak, understanding instinctively that trust was a delicate thread, easily broken, and that it needed to be woven with painstaking patience and profound respect. He spoke to her about the day's tasks, about the cattle lowing in the distance, about the unpredictable whims of the weather, his voice a low, constant murmur that filled the lingering emptiness of the house, a soothing presence in the vast quiet. He spoke not expecting a reply, but simply to offer a steadying sound, a human anchor in her turbulent world. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Winona began to explore the immediate surroundings of the cabin. She would spend hours absorbed in her observations, a tiny naturalist in the vast desert. She watched the desert birds, their vibrant colors a startling contrast against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. She collected an eclectic assortment of colorful stones, their smooth surfaces polished by the wind and sand, and arranged them in intricate patterns on the porch steps. She followed the barely visible tracks of the desert animals in the fine dust, her small fingers tracing their paths with an innate understanding. Jed watched her from a distance, a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in decades. He saw the burgeoning signs of a curious, resilient child slowly emerging from the protective shell of trauma she had built around herself, a flicker of life returning to a face once shadowed by profound sorrow. One afternoon, while Jed was mending the persistent breaks in the corral fence, his brow furrowed in concentration against the afternoon sun, Winona approached him. She walked, with a quiet grace, carrying a small, vibrant blue wildflower clutched carefully in her hand, its delicate petals a stark, almost startling burst of color against the drab landscape. She extended the flower to him, her dark eyes, usually so guarded, now fixed on his with an intensity that made his breath catch. Jed stopped what he was doing, laying down his hammer and nails, and gently took the fragile bloom, a lump forming in his throat. It was a gesture small in its scale, yet overwhelmingly profound in its meaning. A fragile bridge being built over the deep chasm of their two vastly different lives, a silent offering of connection. He smiled at her, a genuine, unforced smile that softened the hard lines of his weathered face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Thank you, Winona," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but filled with an unexpected tenderness. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in her presence since that first night. She seemed to like the sound of it, a subtle shift in her posture, a faint, almost imperceptible blush coloring her high cheekbones. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a silent affirmation of their nascent bond. From that day forward, the silences between them began to change. They were no longer silences of mistrust or fear, but rather shared silences, comfortable pauses in a burgeoning communication that transcended mere words. Winona began to accompany him on his chores, her small shadow often trailing his larger one. She watched him with an almost scientific attention as he tended to the animals, carefully milking the cow or feeding the chickens, or as he painstakingly cultivated the small garden patch, coaxing life from the dry soil. She absorbed his methods, his movements, a silent apprentice in the art of ranching. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and deep purple, they would sit together on the porch, bathe in the growing twilight. The vast expanse of the desert stretched out before them, silent and watchful, under the burgeoning gaze of a million stars that slowly began to prickle the inky blackness. Jed would point out the constellations, their ancient patterns twinkling in the vastness, telling her the stories his own mother had taught him when he was a boy. The hunter, the bear, the dipper. Winona would listen in rapt silence, her hand sometimes brushing against his, a tentative, comforting touch that spoke volumes. One night, as the harvest moon cast a silvery glow over the silent lands, Cape, Winona pointed to a particularly bright star, its light piercing the darkness with an almost defiant brilliance. Jed didn't understand what she was trying to convey, so she picked up a piece of charcoal from the dying embers of the fireplace, its tip still warm, and drew on the smooth, worn wood of the floorboard. She sketched a simple but distinct symbol, a diamond shape with rays radiating outwards from its center, like a miniature sun. Jed furrowed his brow, trying to decipher the drawing. He didn't recognize any Apache symbols from the few interactions he'd had with the tribes. Winona then pointed to herself, a small finger tapping her chest, and then to the star she had indicated in the sky, repeating the diamond with rays drawing. Slowly, patiently, understanding dawned in Jed. It was her name, or perhaps a personal symbol for her name, in her own language, a visual representation of her identity. It was a form of communication he hadn't yet fully grasped, a hint of a rich, complex world of stories and meaning waiting to be revealed. He picked up the charcoal from her hand, its roughness a familiar comfort, and tried to copy the drawing on the wooden floor beside hers, his finger awkwardly tracing the lines that she had rendered with such natural grace and precision. Winona watched with intense concentration, her eyes following his every movement. Then, with a gentle firmness, she reached out, correcting his hand with her own small one, guiding his fingers, showing him the correct form of the symbol, patiently refining his clumsy attempt. On that quiet night, under the brilliant gaze of the Arizona stars, Jedediah Stone and Winona took yet another profound step in their improbable journey. They were learning each other's language, not just of words, but of gestures, of shared understanding. They were building a home, not just with wood and stone, but in the shared silences and the small, tender gestures of kindness that spoke louder than any spoken promise. The dust of the past still lingered, clinging to the edges of their new existence, but under the vast and promising sky of the American West, a new story was being quietly, courageously written, line by line, symbol by symbol. The seasons shifted over Jedediah's ranch, each bringing its own unique palette of colors and a fresh set of challenges. and the profound relationship between him and Winona blossomed with the tender resilience of wildflowers after a life-giving rain. Winona, once a silent and deeply withdrawn child, now laughed freely, her clear, joyful peals echoing through the vast, open valley as she ran through the sun-drenched fields with Jed's loyal sheepdog, a scruffy, devoted companion she had affectionately named Spirit. The dog, in turn, seemed to have taken on a new lease on life, energized by her boundless youthful energy, his tail a constant blur of motion. Her very presence had infused the quiet ranch with a vibrant, new energy, dispelling the lingering shadows of Jed's former solitude. Jed learned more about Winona's past, not through direct recounting of traumatic events, but through the subtle language of her actions, the intricate drawings she'd scratch in the dust with a twig, the hesitant, almost shy gestures she'd make to illustrate a point, or the brief, fleeting expressions that crossed her face as she remembered. He pieced together the fragments of her history, discovering that her father had been a respected Apache warrior, known for his bravery and wisdom, and her mother, a remarkably skilled artisan, whose hands could weave beauty from raw materials. The fragile peace treaty, he understood, had arrived too late for them, their lives tragically consumed by the brutal tides of conflict. Winona rarely spoke directly about these harrowing details, but her dark eyes would sometimes cloud over, darkening with an ancient, profound sadness, a deep-seated sorrow that haunted her whenever these poignant memories resurfaced, casting a brief shadow over her otherwise brightening spirit. Over time, Jed, with a patience he hadn't realized he possessed, began to teach Winona to read and write in English using an old, leather-bound book of classic Western tales that had belonged to his late wife, its pages worn soft with age and affection. Winona was an exceptionally quick study, her mind remarkably keen and avid for knowledge, soaking up each new word like the parched desert earth absorbs a precious drop of rain. Her nimble fingers quickly mastered the awkward grip of the pencil, and her understanding of the complex alphabet grew with astonishing speed. In return, with an equally patient and eager spirit, she taught Jed words and intricate symbols from her own native Apache tongue, slowly revealing to him the profound beauty, the deep spiritual connection, and the intricate complexity of her rich ancestral culture. He learned of the land's sacred significance, the wisdom of the elders, and the deep reverence for nature inherent in her people's way of life. The nascent community nearby, initially wary and overtly curious about the unprecedented presence of a young Apache girl living freely on Jed's remote ranch, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to accept her. The quiet, unwavering kindness of Jed and the undeniably gentle, earnest nature of Winona, gradually, one small gesture at a time, began to chip away at the hardened walls of prejudice that had long stood in their isolated corner of the West. The general store owner in town, a gruff but ultimately kind man named Silas, now deliberately reserved a small bag of peppermint candies for her whenever Jed came to trade, a silent acknowledgement of her growing presence. The blacksmith's wife, a stern but fair woman with calloused hands, even painstakingly stitched a vibrant new dress for Winona from colorful fabric scraps, its bright patterns a stark contrast to her faded, travel-worn clothes. However, not everyone in the scattered settlements was as welcoming or understanding. The lingering scars of conflict ran deep, and the seeds of fear and prejudice had taken firm root in some hearts. There were still those who looked upon Winona with suspicion, their gazes hardened by years of animosity and misunderstanding. Their hearts remained stubbornly calloused, unwilling to yield to compassion. Jed, ever vigilant, instinctively protected Winona from these wary, sometimes hostile, stares, his strong, weathered arm often instinctively encircling her small shoulders. When they ventured into town, a silent, powerful shield against the whispers and judging eyes, he would meet their gazes with his own unwavering stare, daring them to challenge his quiet guardianship. One clear, crisp morning, an ancient Apache chief, a man of profound wisdom, with a face etched deep with the lines of countless seasons and a gaze that held the quiet power of the desert itself, arrived at the ranch. His name was Chayton, and his presence carried an undeniable aura of authority and ancient knowledge. He had heard distant whispers, carried on the wind, of the young Apache girl who was living peacefully with the solitary white rancher. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken history. When Chayton and Jed met for the first time, two men from vastly different worlds, their paths converging under the shared, watchful presence of Winona. Their initial greetings were formal, polite, but laden with the weight of generations of conflict and misunderstanding. Chayton spent a long, unhurried time with Winona, conversing softly in their native Apache tongue, their voices low and melodic, a language that was a beautiful mystery to Jed. He observed them from a respectful distance, a complex mix of emotions swirling within him. A sharp pang of jealousy at their shared language and cultural connection, mingled paradoxically with a profound sense of relief that Winona was reconnecting with her heritage, a part of herself he could never provide. He knew this day might inevitably come, the day her own people would reclaim her, and he had braced himself for that moment, though his heart ached at the thought. As the day waned and the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in soft, fading colors, Chayton finally approached Jed. His gaze was serious, his eyes holding a depth of understanding, but there was no hostility in them, only a quiet resolve. He spoke slowly, his English hesitant but deliberate, each word chosen with care. "You have cared for her well, rancher. She remembers her people, her traditions. But she has found kindness here, a rare thing." Jed's heart tightened in his chest, a familiar knot of apprehension forming. He knew what was coming, the inevitable, painful farewell. "She is free to go," Jed said, his voice a low, rough whisper, thick with unspoken emotion. The words catching in his throat, Chayton shook, his head slowly, a subtle, knowing gesture. "Winona will make her own choice. That is the Apache way." Then, Chayton turned to Winona. His face softened and spoke a few more words in Apache, his voice clear and comforting. Jed watched intently as the young girl looked from Chayton, her face a mask of profound thought, to him, her dark eyes filled with a deep, silent contemplation. The profound silence that followed seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Each tick of the distant clock amplified in the quiet afternoon. Finally, Winona, with a deliberate, firm movement, reached out and took Jed's calloused hand in her small, warm one, a silent declaration. She then looked back at Chayton, her gaze unwavering, and spoke in Apache, her voice clear and remarkably steady, carrying the weight of her decision. Chayton listened, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly, a slight, knowing smile finally curving his lips. When Chayton departed at dusk, his silhouette slowly disappearing into the vast, darkening landscape, he carried with him the quiet certainty that the Apache girl had indeed found a true home, not necessarily among her blood kin, but undeniably alongside a kind, solitary white man whose heart had opened wide enough to embrace her as his own. He understood that belonging was not always defined by shared heritage, but often by shared kindness. That evening, as twilight deepened into night, Jed and Winona sat together on the familiar porch, the sky still ablaze with the vibrant, lingering colors of the sunset, fiery oranges, soft pinks, and deep purples melting into an infinite blue. Winona nestled close to Jed, her small head resting comfortably against his shoulder. A perfect fit. He passed his arm around her, feeling the comforting warmth of her small body against his larger, weathered frame, a feeling of completeness he hadn't felt in a lifetime. "What did you say to him, Winona?" Jed asked softly, his voice thick, with emotion barely above a whisper. Winona looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with an inner light, reflecting the first glimmer of stars. "I told him I have two families now," she replied, her voice a soft, clear melody. "One that gave me life, and another that gave me love." Tears, hot and unexpected, welled up in Jed's tired eyes, tracing paths through the dust and worry. Lines on his face. He pulled Winona closer, holding her tightly against him, his heart overflowing with a profound emotion that he could never truly express in mere words. In the vast and often cruel expanse of the American Old West, to solitary souls, a seasoned rancher and a lost Apache girl had found each other, united not by blood, but by an unexpected act of profound kindness and a love that transcended the harsh barriers of Culture, trauma, and prejudice. The story of the Apache girl no one claimed had quietly transformed into the enduring, hopeful story of an unlikely family, forged in the relentless dust of the desert and colored forever by the unwavering hues of trust, compassion, and boundless affection. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more compelling narratives from the Old West, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.